Hi, welcome to the Miss Ink Stamps YouTube channel. My name is Lauren, and I'm going to be sharing how I created a fun scene card with the Magical Collection, starting with the Stay Weird stamps and dies, the Magical Graduation stamps and coordinating die set, the Magical Newspaper background stamp, as well as the Magic Stars and Perspective Floor stencils. I'm going to start with my ink blending as it's going to need the most time to dry. So I'm just putting a little grip mat that I have here on my glass mat, and I secured a piece of watercolor cardstock. I'm starting with my ground, so I'm using pumice stone just to add a layer of gray color, and I'm going to be using the cobblestone of the Perspective Floor stencil. To color in the stones, I'm bringing in black soot distress oxide, but as I ink blend it, I'm kind of realizing this is a little darker than I was thinking in my head. So I'm going to bring back pumice stone and just add in some more color and blend these two together. So that way it's not too dark. They still look like gray stones, and it will match really well with the area in between all of the different stones on the ground. I love this stencil. It's so great to have in your collection. It just gives so much perspective to the card and just creates, a more accurate looking scene. I went ahead and masked off the top of my cobblestone ground, and I'm going to ink on some grass. So this is just a grassy stencil from my stash, and I'm using mowed lawn to add in a layer of grass. I went a little higher than I would normally do, but I'm going to offset my stencil and add in a second layer, so that way it just looks like it's a really grassy background. In my head, I'm thinking that my characters are going to be in this dark forest, so I wanted it to look kind of messy, kind of unkept. Now this particular stencil has a mask on the other side, so I'm lowering it down to mask the green grass that I just ink blended, and I'm going to start creating my sky. I'm going to go from light to dark because I want it to look more like an evening night sky. So I'm starting with tumbled glass, and I'm adding it in between each of those little grass sections on my stencil, and then ink blending up. And I apologize for my shaky camera. I'm kind of an aggressive ink blender, so I do apologize that it's a little wobbly right here, but I wanted to show each of my ink blending layers. So after using tumbled glass, I'm using Stormy Sky to be my mid-tone. So again, going from a light to dark. And the very top of my sky is going to be Chip Sapphire, which is pretty dark. So I am going to go back through each of these different colors and blend them a little better together. So now that I have my Chip Sapphire on, I'm going to bring back out that Stormy Sky and just kind of blend that a little better. And because I'm adding more Stormy Sky, I'm going to bring back Tumbled Glass and ink blend again between those two colors. So I'm just trying to create a nice kind of gradual ombre look in my sky. Once I pulled up my stencil, I realized that I didn't leave the best gap, so I have some white marks in my grass. So I'm just going through with my tumbled glass and just trying to get rid of some of that white. There still is a little bit left, but I think it looks fine. So I peeled off my mask, and now I'm going to add in some gold watercolor for some splatter. This is just a basic metallic, different shades of gold watercolor, and I'm splattering on more of I believe this was more of a yellow gold. Once it was dry, I'm going to grab a nested A2 die and die cut out my scene. And I'm going to stencil on some of my magic stars. And I did my die cutting first because I didn't want to have to worry about die cutting with stencil paste. It can muck up your plates and your dies, so I do my die cutting before I do any stencil paste. Grabbing a palette knife, I'm just going to add some of this gold stencil paste onto my stencil and through the stars. I got a little crazy with the amount of stencil paste, so I pick up any excess and put it right back in the jar. I'm going to make sure I have a nice layer across my stencil, and then we'll do another stencil reveal, my favorite. I'm going to pull off my mask, and here you can see those gold stars on my background. I just love it on my sky along with the splatter. It's a lot of shine and a lot of fun. I'm going to go ahead and put everything into a soapy dish to soak while I continue on with my card. I'm going to be making another background. So that was my scene that my characters are going to be on, but I cut it to be smaller than an A2 card. So I'm creating an A2 card front to be behind my evening scene. I have an A2 piece of kind of a vanilla cream cardstock, and I'm inking up my magical newspaper with vintage photo distress oxide, and I'm using my Misty to stamp it because I wasn't sure if I was going to need to stamp it more than once, as I know stamping with distress oxides doesn't always come out perfectly the first time because it is more of a mixed media ink than a stamping ink, but I really liked it. It did have a nice vintage feel. So I'm going to also distress the edges of this background just using a domed foam ink blender and that vintage photo distress oxide, and I really like how it layers behind my scene. It's still drying, so we're going to move on to stamping and coloring and cutting out my images, which I did off camera as I just wanted to show more about the card rather than coloring. But if you have any questions, just let me know in the comments. I used some alcohol marker friendly black ink on some alcohol marker friendly cardstock, and I colored them in with Ohuhu Honolulu Bee art markers. So I'm adding my card front to my card base now that everything is ready to go. It's dry and we can start assembling. And I just use a tape runner to attach that down to the card base, and the same for my evening scene. And I just glued that to the center of the card base. After playing around with all of my images, I have a rough idea of how I want my layout to be. So I'm going to trim off the wand, even though I colored it, from my girl character here, and I'm gluing a little radish down into her hand. I know that these magical creatures prefer red meat, but we're using the radish from the Stay Weird stamp set because I thought it was really cute. Once I have everything ready, I'm going to add some foam adhesive behind all of my different images here. So I'm starting with my magical creature, and I'm putting it to the far right, like right up against the edge of the card and towards the back because it is a large creature. So it's a little small compared to my two students here. So I wanted that creature to be further back to help with the perspective of the card. And then I added my two students also with foam adhesive, but I realized that my little radish was extending past the edge of the card. So I very, very carefully peeled it up. It did rip a little bit, but you're not going to see my girl character's hand because I'm going to glue that radish right back on. And I tilted it more in so that way it's actually on the card and not off the card. And there's a little foam adhesive behind the kind of green part of that turnip, so there is stability behind all of my stamped images. I picked one of my favorite sentiments from the Stay Weird stamp set. It says "You're not normal," and I love it. And I'm just fussy cutting around my sentiment so that way I could just pop it right up onto my card background. I'm using some foam adhesive, some small squares, again, just popping everything up to be on the same level as my images. And again, I'm adding this to the top part of my card. I went with the top right as my characters are kind of more in the bottom left, and I like that kind of diagonal flow when you look at a card. Here's a close-up of how this scene card turned out. I hope you like it and it brings you some inspiration today. You can find everything that I used from Missing Stamps linked down below, and make sure you also check out some other videos for Missing Stamps, and I hope you have a wonderful day.